Good morning and welcome to another edition of Council Matters, and I'm Mick Fitz, and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by our newest guest. It's Councillor Michael O'Brien, and Michael is representing the AntiAusterity Alliance out there in Donaghmede, Beaumont. So Michael, welcome to Council Matters.
Thanks very much, nice to be here.
Michael, just as a not getting too semantic about it or making too much words about it, I know yourself, I know Paul Murphy, I know Joe Higgins. You're all good, staunch members of the Socialist Party. Where does the Socialist Party end and the AAA begin, or what's the difference between them? Just as I say, for the benefit of listeners.
Well, out of the 14 or so Anti-Austerity Alliance councils elected across the country, 8 who were originally selected were Socialist Party members, and the rest weren't. And in terms of the candidates who ran across the state, 40 or so, it was about half and half.
Okay.
So basically what happened is, out of the campaign that was waged against the home tax and property tax, a point was reached where there was a debate about mounting an electoral challenge flowing from that campaign. And really what we wanted to do in the Socialist Party was facilitate new activists ordinary residents who weren't previously politically active but who were basically agreed with us on some of the fundamental points about opposing cuts and austerity, and facilitate them contesting the election. So we formed the umbrella of the Anti-Austerity Alliance, and contested on that basis.
Something that I was very interested in, I'd like to hear your view on it. At the time we had, after the last council elections, we had 2 by-elections, and generally speaking, people were saying, oh, they were Sinn Féin's to lose. They did lose them, and they lost them both to either Socialist Party or Anti-Austerity Alliance. Now, 2 things I said to people, particularly after the Paul Murphy's victory, was that it proved 2 things: is that Sinn Féin can't get voters out, and second of all, that the majority of people out in these parts of the world do not see Sinn Féin as a left-wing party. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'd pose it slightly differently. I think Sinn Féin across the state are likely to remain, for the foreseeable, the most obvious political weapon of choice for people who are opposed to austerity. They're a bigger organisation, that they're more extensively organised, but in areas, particularly around Dublin and other urban areas, where there is a challenge to the left of Sinn Féin, and where those candidates or organisations have a record of activity in their own right, but also as well where you have people themselves getting active or beginning to get active on issues, whether it's housing in the case of Dublin West, or more recently the water tax issue in Dublin South West. They actually begin to examine the candidates and the parties that bit closer and judge them maybe a bit differently than if they weren't politically active. And I think that's really what prevailed in Dublin South West, that it boiled down to not just opposition to the water tax, because that was a given, but actually what tactics and strategy was needed to defeat it. And so the vote almost became a referendum on the non-payment strategy, or advocating non-payment. That's really what it boiled down to, and we prevailed over Sinn Féin in that argument.
Yeah. To a certain degree, and I know there are different interpretations of how close it was, but you seem to be able to work closer with people before profit than Sinn Féin. Why were Sinn Féin not considered in this left-wing alliance, or is that them rejecting you rather than you rejecting them?
Well, I think obviously the politics of people before profit and other left organisations and left-leaning independents would approximate more with what the Anti-Austerity Alliance stands for, in terms of a very consistent opposition to austerity, but also that we feel that change would be best achieved by organising people, at a street and a state level, and getting people themselves active in politics. So we have more of an orientation towards struggle than trying to get piecemeal reforms through Parliament or through the Council. And we feel that Sinn Féin's bluff has been called on their consistent opposition to austerity in terms of, well, recently the North and the cuts they've agreed with the Westminster government, but also in terms of the recent budget votes in Dublin City Council, South Dublin County Council, and probably elsewhere too, where they voted through budgets that have effectively normalised the property taxes, which certainly we and others found quite objectionable.
Yeah. At the time, and I'm talking really here about the time of the European elections, people were saying, oh, the if you like, the competition between Socialist Party and people before profit, in other words, between Paul and Breed, that it was damaging. As it turned out, it was actually brilliant, because you've got the South Dublin seat, and I think if people were to say to Paul Murphy last April, what would you prefer to be, a TD or an MEP, he would have taken the TD stance. Was that just a bit of luck, or was it a piece of brilliant planning?
It was a bit of luck, to be honest with you. I mean, in terms of the European elections, I mean,
Paul should have taken the seat. I mean,
well, he was in with a show. I mean, it's impossible to say for certain. I mean, we always felt that it was going to be a major challenge for Paul to defend the seat that was won by Joe Higgins. We felt that Paul was a brilliant MEP, but it's very difficult to make an impact as an MEP in popular consciousness. And really, what we wanted was Paul to be seen as a contender, but the radical left potential vote was divided.
It was.
And that served to write both Paul and Breed to a degree out of the equation in terms of the media narrative, and we weren't able to build up the kind of momentum that built up behind Joe Higgins in 2009. So that said, he got an extremely credible vote, and he was then well positioned for the by-election that took place a few months later.
Yeah, because we could have ended up with the situation where Paul was the MEP and Cahill was the TD. I suspect Socialist Party are actually more comfortable having Brian Hayes out of the way and Paul in there fighting for local issues.
Well, I mean, just from our point of view, the Dáil is obviously a less remote institution than the European Parliament, and we think Paul is making a much bigger impact now, even in the few weeks he's been in the Dáil, than he would have been able to make as an MEP. But just it's the way it works here with the media and so on. There's far more attention to what takes place in Dáil Ireland than in the European Parliament.
Yeah. Michael, the first time we noticed yourself after you became Councillor Michael O'Brien Greyhound, you were very strong in support of the workers there. You even, as I say, got your collar felt to a certain degree. What was the thinking behind that? Because you went from being an activist to a representative, and people would say, well, you usually use activists for doing those. You clearly felt that it was important to be seen to be supporting the workers.
Well, with any campaign like that, you have to try and lead from the front. I mean, we were prompted, I won't say by who, to organise local solidarity work around the Greyhound strike, not just in Coolock, Kilmore, but in other parts of Dublin as well. Other activists and left-wing representatives were similarly approached to organise that type of work because the picket at that stage in Craig Avenue, Clondalkin, was not being effective. There was a very comprehensive strike breaking operation happening. And therefore, you know, we myself and other activists in the area, like, not all AntiAusterity Alliance, but from a variety of groups, responded very positively, and residents did likewise, to impede the collection of waste by strike breaking Labour. It was a necessary stand, and then subsequent to that, the breaking of the injunction by most of the strikers at Craig Avenue really brought the issue to an absolute head, and they got a credible settlement. You know, I think so. It was a very worthwhile thing to do.
Did yourself and the party see that as some sort of line in the sand that people are actually being asked to take to trade off, if you like, salary or pay against security?
Well, the problem really for us is that it was the scale of the cut was monumental.
40% or something, wasn't it?
It's 35%, and then the redundancy conditions were statutory, you know, the minimum allowable, so it was quite derisory. But even prior to that, like, the work regime was very hard, and it was people were just being driven out of the job. That's how they felt about it. And at the outset, they adhered to the letter of the law in terms of how to conduct a picket. But the problem we have in this country with the Industrial Relations Act, Public Order Act, and Road Traffic, all the acts that came into play in this dispute, is that if you adhere to every dot and comma of the law when it comes to an industrial dispute, when you're up against a determined employer who can employ strike-breaking labour, it's very, very difficult to win. And therefore we had to kind of step over the bounds of injunctions and the bounds of law, not just activists but workers themselves, and run the risk of being committed to prison, which some of the workers did run that risk, in order to prevail with a decent settlement at the end.
Yeah. And let's be fair, some of the members of the Socialist Party have a history of standing up to that in the past with bin charges.
Well, you see, the debate that always happens, like when Gardaí arrive on the scene, whether it's the bin tax or Greyhound, or more recently around water meter protests, is that it's uncontested out there that we have the right to protest. But the problem is that the type of protest that's tolerated is often the tokenistic, ineffective, and doesn't alter the course of events. Whereas, you know, we feel that a case can be built on particular occasions to to engage in mass civil disobedience, preferably mass civil disobedience, particularly when it comes to matters of basic economic survival, which is what we're facing, like with the water tax, for example.
So, I gather you were at Coolock Garda Station last week. I've only seen some of the images or some of the videos. seemed to be, at the very least, noisy. What did you make of it?
Well, I was a bit late on the scene because I had a prior council meeting to attend, but it wasn't the first protest outside Coolock.
Oh, I appreciate that.
There's been a few in recent weeks, but that was the biggest. And I think there's just been a build-up of frustration and annoyance among residents who prior to the water tax campaign would have held the Gardaí in quite high esteem, and I think the Gardaí as a police force traditionally have enjoyed high levels of esteem compared to police forces in other countries. But what I've observed over the course of the last month and a half, because of the level of Garda deployments in working class communities in the northeast, is that their stock has declined immeasurably. And the manner in which some of them, not all of them, but some of them have engaged with people, some of the variables and all that has been extremely antagonistic. And I think it came to a boiling point last week with the use of pepper spray and the way they manhandled some of the protesters in Northwood earlier on that day when they were protesting against Enda Kenny. You know, for an activist like me, it doesn't come as a huge surprise that Gardaí will drag you away if you engage in a sit-down protest. But actually, you know, these are guards in the public order unit, the branch who are used to maybe dealing with rowdy football fans or hardened political elements, but they're not able to adjust to dealing with ordinary residents, and they use the same rough techniques to deal with them, and we've seen the consequences last week.
Because we have a family friend who's a Garda, and I said it to them last weekend. Did the Gardaí overreact? Did they lose it? Because the videos that I saw, pepper spray is not designed. It's not like, oh, please go home. It is designed. It stings. It's not, it's not a pleasant experience. And I didn't really see the need to escalate to that level. Is there a danger that we've now that is now the floor rather than the ceiling from protests? And I'm not talking about from the protesters' point of view.
It's impossible to say in advance how far it'll go. But what I will say though is that the biggest inhibitor in terms of Garda violence is numbers. That if you have sufficient critical mass of people out, and it's plain for all to see that it's overwhelmingly ordinary residents, not hardened kind of political activists. And then you have a social media presence and all that. That's the best inhibitor we have. In terms of forcing the guards back, but this is a political issue as well. The guards are being deployed; they're organised effectively along military lines, orders from above, and they're on a collision course with the working class communities who are up in arms over this water tax agenda.
Well, that's an interesting one, Malcolm, because I had one of the anti-water charge protesters on a few weeks ago, and the point I made to this person is that. Is the response a class response? And what I mean by that is that just take two areas on the north side. I live in Clontarf. Well, it's probably an exaggeration to say they were bringing them out tea and biscuits. The meters went in without a whimper. Nobody, okay, it was noisy and all that, but I never heard one person complaining. Not that they're supporting it, but I never heard one person complaining. Whereas I go 2 kilometres across the way where I know people in Donamead, and it was virtually like people saw the meter people as an invading force. And I thought, we're all Dubliners, we're Northsiders, what's the different response? And the only explanation I could put was, this lot are better off than that lot. And as such, are better able to absorb that cost. How do you feel about that?
I think that's one of 3 factors which I think determines the scale of local resistance. Definitely the areas where people feel the pinch more are more likely to offer up resistance, but it's not the only factor. I think that a mood of confidence has built up steadily over the course of the year. For example, in some very working class areas, in areas where we're quite well organised, like in Dublin 15, but also in Harmonstown, the meters got in quite early because that was in the immediate aftermath of the setback of the property tax campaign. People's heads were down, and so they were able to take advantage of that for a period, and then confidence is built up. So that's a factor. And then I think local organisational factors do count, because I think we've seen a lot of resistance in the northeast of the city. We've seen good resistance in Crumlin, Drimna, where there's, and we will see resistance in Tallaght, where there's good levels of organisation and preparation. I think the struggles we've been up against it a bit in Cabra. I think that they have getting them in there, and I think that work needs to be done there to try and organise people a bit more, because they're making a bit too much progress there, certainly for my own liking, but hopefully that can be stemmed.
But as you know yourself, the umpire strikes back. How do you think it will happen? I know a few people have already been locked up for weekends, and one person we know got locked up for a couple of weeks for for associated reasons. I won't go into any further than that. Do you think it might dissipate, or do you think it might get a hardened resolve if people start seeing their friends and neighbours getting locked up?
Well, that's a political calculation that the government and the judiciary have to make. I mean, what I will say is this: is that the injunction obtained last week was the second injunction, an enhanced injunction with a 20-metre exclusion zone around protests taking place. But the prior injunction they had also effectively ruled out engaging in protest action. But that injunction was a dead letter within a matter of days. Like, it was basically being flouted, on a daily basis, not just in the northeast of Dublin, but in other parts of the country as well, in Kilkenny, Limerick, Donegal. There's been daily protests. So we called our bluff once, and then they had to go and get a second, more enhanced injunction. And there's protests this morning in Newbrook and Donamead, likewise yesterday in Curracloe Avenue in Donamead. There were protests taking place, and I think people have indicated to me a willingness to end up in the High Court and not to give an undertaking to desist, and therefore the ball is firmly in the court of the judiciary and the establishment. Are they going to jail residents for engaging in protest activity? And we have to see then what kind of response that can elicit. And they have demonstrated a reluctance so far to jail, and similarly in Greyhound, that they showed a reluctance to jail people who are not going to adhere to injunctions, because I think they know that there's a volatile kind of atmosphere out there, and it could actually galvanise the opposition even further.
Yeah. Let's move on, Michael. This 2 days ago we had Dublin City Council's budget for 2015. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, normally I would spend a Tuesday looking at the podcast or the webcast, but unfortunately it went down after 55 minutes because we use a company based in Britain. Did you know that?
I mean, no.
They do. Dublin City Council, to be fair, you do a good podcast, but this was just a bit unfortunate timing, just as she's telling us what's in the budget.
Yeah.
You were very critical. Now, and this is what I'm quite interested to hear your take on this. As I mentioned earlier, Dermot Lacey was saying, "Oh well, I would love to see Sinn Fein pass a Dublin City Council budget." The Lord Mayor even said he never passed one in his many number of years.
40-something years, yeah.
What do you make of the new establishment Sinn Fein on Dublin City Council? They've got, they have a serious mandate in there. They've got a big block of votes.
They're the biggest party in the council chamber, and what happened this week did not come as a surprise to me in the slightest, because after the local elections took place in May, there was negotiations about forming a ruling majority and a rotation of mayorships between various political forces. It wasn't something I was involved in myself, obviously being the only Anti-Austerity Alliance councillor. And effectively we had a Labour, Sinn Fein, Green Party, independent coalition, not all the independents, but most of them, and there's a rotation agreed for the 5 years in terms of mayorships and deputy mayorships, and there was other negotiations about lucrative chairmanships of special policy committees, and that was all predicated on budgets going through, so it came as no surprise to me that would happen. And I think on the surface one can say that the budget was stable relative to last year's budget in terms that you can't identify drastic cuts here or there, and that's the way it's been kind of sold publicly. However, in light of the scale of the housing crisis, it was definitely inadequate, and remains to be seen what exactly they're going to do. But specifically in terms of my own mandate as an Anti-Austerity Alliance councillor, the property tax and how the property tax proceeds are to be used, to me was a highly contentious issue, in this sense that when the property tax was imposed, we were told as part of the soft sale that it would be an enhancement of local services and so on, whereas what has happened in reality, that of the 70 million that they project to raise from the property tax in 2015, after you take away what will be kind of handed over to other less populated local authorities around the country, basically some 49 million euro out of 53 million euro property tax receipts next year will be used to replace other grants that have been withdrawn by central government. So it's a complete con, and it normalises the projects. And the debate in terms of among the establishment parties last Monday was mainly about a slight variation in commercial rates, but to me the big issue was this 50 million almost robbery of property tax receipts that was going to plug a gap. And in a sense, if you look at it on a statewide scale, property tax receipts being used to replace central government grants, and then that money being held onto the exchequer to service odious debt in 2015 and so on, and to the tune of 8 billion. and then Sinn Féin standing over that in not just in Dublin City Council but in South Dublin County Council. There's the same configuration of Sinn Féin, Labour, Green Party, Independent, whereas in Dunleary and in Fingal, where Sinn Féin are a smaller force, they were part of the, if you like, the opposition, like alongside the Anti-Austerity Alliance and other lefts. Because they weren't in the driving seat, they weren't occupying a position of influence, and their votes weren't needed to get the budget through. So it's not consistent.
Yeah. How do you feel at this? I'd be interested in your view on this, from a philosophic point of view. I said, and I've said this to Labour Party people, is that I never made an investment in property. I bought a home. That's the reality, and now they're charging me as though I was a property speculator. By the way they did that, I'm saying that they turned people from citizens into consumers. It's a philosophic point, yes. But in other words, and it's something that we will see from time and time again at council meetings now, is that the market is the moral authority now, and this is something I'd be interested to hear your view on, Malcolm.
Yeah, well, we have, if you like, where private sector norm has been imported into public service delivery. I mean, I was a public servant in a previous life, and the public became the customer all of a sudden, and then
or the client even.
Yeah, and then what was the city manager is now the chief executive.
Exactly.
So you have all these kind of norms, and then you have the steady commodification of what were public services. We've had it with the bin collection service. We have it now taking place with water. So yeah, that's that's what the drift that we've been seeing over the last number of years.
Yeah, that when I was hearing about these negotiations that were taking place after the last council elections, I thought, well, they're going to sit down there and they're going to work out policy and priorities and all sorts of things like that. But programs and costings and all of that. And I discovered really it hadn't got very much to do with that at all. It seemed to be more about personalities. It seemed to be more about symbols. And the reason why that struck me is that Sinn Féin's priority didn't seem to be homelessness or property tax. It seemed to be getting the mayorship for 2016, which was a very symbolic action. Is that being too cynical, or is that essentially what came out of those negotiations?
Look, I don't want to do a disservice to each and every member or representative in Sinn Féin, because I don't doubt that they're, as individuals and then as an organisation, preoccupied with the homelessness crisis. But the question is what is the required policy response? How do we actually achieve on resolving the issue of the accommodation crisis in this city? And the problem I have with their approach is that they've already entered into a drift of compromising with establishment parties as a precursor to going into coalition nationally in the aftermath of the next general election, and an orientation towards piecemeal reform, whereas my orientation is different. That real change will come from below. That if you activate people themselves, including people affected by the homelessness crisis, on their own behalf, well then you can actually go places, and you don't have to kind of be trading off, because it was some general said that you can only negotiate what you've already won on the battlefield. And for me, the battlefield is the campaign that takes place out in wider society, the struggle. And we have actually made progress in this sense on the homelessness issue. That the government were accommodation crisis deniers, to my mind, at the start of the year. And then it was actually people like Tamara Cairns, Gwen Connell, who are affected by the issue themselves, kind of normal working class people who aren't your stereotypical homeless, and they went public on the issue. And then a groundswell of kind of activity began to emerge on the issue, and I think the establishment began to feel a bit of pressure and the need to at least make noises towards responding to the situation. Now, they haven't in any way gone far enough, but for me, the lesson is this year is that campaigning activity is really where it's at in terms of extracting, what needs to be extracted from the system to deliver on the accommodation issue. Whereas, if you start going into compromises with establishment parties and the return for mayorships and committee chairpersonships, and then going into coalition subsequent on a national level, well, then your effectiveness can be blunted, as we've seen in the past with other parties that pose themselves as being progressive going into coalition.
Something, I asked the outgoing Lord Mayor Oisin Quinn about this time last year. I was asking him about homelessness, and one of the points I put to him is, should there be some form of charter for Dublin City Council that says nobody will not have a roof over their head that once, in other words, we put in certain minimum safety nets, and then he went into something about redefining homelessness and how homelessness was not the guys on the streets, which I appreciate, that it was a lot more complex. But do you think that that is something, particularly as a city, that we should at least be saying to people, and I appreciate that not everybody wants a roof over their head, but at the very least, with winter coming, you shouldn't have to sleep in doorways, you shouldn't be sleeping on cardboard boxes, in the middle of Abbey Street.
Yeah, well, I think if that's enshrined in the form of a charter, that's fine. But then the question is that objective going to be resourced enough?
Oh, of course, yes, I appreciate that. Yeah.
And so, we can sweat over overdoing getting the right charter that's correctly worded and correctly defines homelessness in all its various forms, because you have couch surfers and you have, as you say, it's not just people on the streets, it's people in emergency accommodation and so on. But the resource issue, and to me, if you look at the history of the state, going right back to its formation, I don't have the figures in front of me now, but I had a question asked by Joe Higgins, the Oireachtas Library and Research Department, about the amount of social houses built every year since the state's formation. And what you'll see is that in the 50s and again in the 70s, that there was just massive amounts of social housing built that served to deal with a housing crisis. And interestingly, that the 70s was actually the high point, and it came in the aftermath of a very vigorous housing action campaign in the late 60s, early 70s. And social housing has carried a stigma with it, which I think is going again. But I grew up in Crumlin, and council rented accommodation. It was fine, it was great.
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who's interested, our mutual friend Conor McCabe has written an excellent book on The Sins of the Fathers, I think it was.
Yeah.
Michael, we have run out of time. All I can say is I would have liked to ask you a bit more about 14 days. We've, you got overruled or out of order by the council, but I thought you made an excellent contribution the other night. So, Michael O'Brien, much appreciated. Thanks for your time today.
Cheers. Fair play.